In December 1942, an Italian soldier wrote his last letter home from a frozen trench along the Don River. His fingers were black with frostbite. Ice formed on his pen as he wrote, "The Russians are coming." He scrawled on a scrap of paper torn from a supply manifest, "And we have nothing left to stop them with." He folded the letter. He placed it in his breast pocket. He never mailed it. Within days, he and 70,000 of his comrades would become casualties in the Russian winter. They died not just from Soviet bullets. They died from their own leaders' hunger for glory. How did 250,000 Italians end up fighting a war 2,000 kilometers from home with summer uniforms in -30-degree weather? The answer begins with one man's desperate need to matter. Benito Mussolini stood in Hitler's shadow. This was not how it was supposed to be. In the 1920s, Hitler had studied Mussolini's rise to power. The Italian had invented fascism. He had marched on Rome when Hitler was still giving speeches in beer halls. Mussolini had been the teacher. Hitler had been the student. But by 1940, their positions had reversed. Therefore, Mussolini needed a victory to restore his status. The reversal had been swift and humiliating. Hitler's armies had conquered Poland in 5 weeks. They had crushed France in 6 weeks. They had driven the British off the continent. Meanwhile, Mussolini's invasion of Greece had turned into a disaster. Italian troops were retreating. They were begging Germany for help. In North Africa, the British had destroyed entire Italian armies. Hundreds of thousands of Italians had surrendered. German generals mocked Italian incompetence. They called Mussolini's army tourists in uniform. June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers invaded the Soviet Union. Mussolini learned about it from a radio broadcast. Hitler hadn't consulted him. Hitler hadn't warned him. Hitler had treated Italy's leader like a minor ally, not an equal partner. The insult burned in Mussolini's mind. He paced his office in Rome. He slammed his fist on his desk. He shouted at his generals, "Italy must join this war. Italy must share in the victory. Italy must prove it deserved respect." His generals knew better. General Giovanni Mace had fought in World War I. He understood logistics. He understood that Russia was 2,000 kilometers from Italian supply bases. He understood that Italian trucks would break down on Russian roads. He understood that Italian soldiers had no winter training. He presented Mussolini with a report. It listed every reason why sending troops to Russia would fail. Equipment shortages, transportation problems, climate challenges. Mussolini threw the report in the trash. "Italian courage," he declared, "is worth more than German tanks." The decision was made. Italy would send an expeditionary force to Russia. They would call it the CSER, Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia. Initially, about 60,000 men would go. They would fight alongside the Wehrmacht. They would share in the glory of crushing communism. They would prove Italy was a great power. Mussolini broadcast the news on Radio Rome. He called it a crusade against Bolshevism. He said Italian soldiers would defend Christian civilization. He didn't mention they would be fighting with equipment from 1918. The propaganda machine went into action. Newspapers printed stories about the evil of Soviet communism. They described Russian soldiers as barbaric hordes. They promised quick victory. They showed maps with arrows pointing toward Moscow. They never mentioned the distance. They never mentioned the winter. They never mentioned that most Italian soldiers had never seen snow. One recruit from Sicily later wrote, "I had never felt cold before. I didn't know cold could hurt. I didn't know cold could kill." July 1941. The first Italian troops boarded trains heading east. They sang patriotic songs. They waved at crowds. They threw kisses to girlfriends. They believed they would be home by Christmas. Their uniforms were made of light wool. Their boots had cardboard soles reinforced with thin leather. Their rifles were the same model their fathers had carried in World War I. They crossed through Germany. They crossed through Poland. They kept going east. The journey took 3 weeks. With each kilometer, home felt further away. With each day, the landscape grew stranger. The forest grew thicker. The horizons grew wider. The sky grew bigger. But as 60,000 Italian soldiers headed east in the summer of 1941, the real nightmare was yet to come. September 1941, the Battle of Petrikovka. The CSIR faced its first major combat on the Eastern Front. The Italians were ordered to take a Soviet position near the Dnieper River. The temperature was dropping. Autumn rain had turned the ground to mud. The mud was unlike anything in Italy. It sucked at boots. It swallowed wheels. It turned a 1-kilometer march into a 3-hour ordeal. The Italian Pasubio Division led the attack. They advanced across open ground. Soviet machine guns opened fire. Italian soldiers dropped into the mud. They tried to dig foxholes. The mud filled them with water. They tried to set up machine guns. The mud jammed the mechanisms. They tried to call for artillery support. The radios had failed in the moisture. Captain Alberto Manzini watched his men struggle. He wrote in his diary, "We are fighting two enemies, the Russians and the Earth itself." The battle lasted 3 days. The Italians eventually took the position, but the cost was devastating. Not from bullets, from exposure. Men's feet had been wet for 72 hours straight. Their leather boots had disintegrated. Strips of leather hung from their feet like rags. The medical officer examined case after case of trench foot, black toes, purple feet, the smell of rotting flesh. He had no dry socks to give them. He had no replacement boots. He could only shake his head and write "unfit for duty" on their medical cards. Then came the first frost. October 15th, 1941. Soldiers woke to find their blankets frozen stiff. Their water bottles had burst from expanding ice. Their rifles wouldn't fire because the oil had congealed. The temperature was only -5 degrees Celsius. This was just the beginning. General Giovanni Messe toured the front lines. He saw soldiers wrapping their feet in newspaper. He saw them stuffing straw into their uniforms. He saw them burning furniture from abandoned houses to stay warm. He immediately telegraphed Rome. Urgent. Winter equipment required immediately. Men suffering severe cold casualties. Rome's response came 2 weeks later. Make do with available resources. Victory before winter's end. There would be no winter uniforms. There would be no insulated boots. There would be no cold weather lubricants for weapons. Mussolini had decided that requesting winter equipment would make Italy look weak to the Germans. Image mattered more than soldiers' lives. December 1941. The real winter arrived. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Italian soldiers had never experienced such cold. It was a living thing that attacked them. It found every gap in their clothing. It turned exposed skin white in minutes. It froze the moisture in their nostrils with each breath. It made metal burn like fire when touched with bare skin. Sergeant Paolo Conti described it in a letter. "The cold here has weight. It presses down on you. It makes your bones ache. It makes thinking difficult. We move like old men." The Germans watched the Italians suffering with contempt. Wehrmacht soldiers had winter uniforms. They had felt-lined boots. They had special oils for their weapons. They had experience from the previous winter. They saw the Italians as a burden. German officers, assigned Italian units to the worst sectors. They gave them the longest stretches of front to defend. They kept the best supplies for themselves. One German report stated, "Italian forces' combat effectiveness severely degraded by weather. Recommend use as static defense only." More Italians were dying from cold than from combat. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, noses, ears. Men would remove their boots at night and couldn't get them back on because their feet had swollen. They would walk barefoot through snow rather than stay behind. Those who stayed behind froze to death. Bodies were found in the spring, still sitting upright, frozen in the position they died. The CSIR Medical Corps reported that by January 1942, over 3,000 men had been hospitalized for severe frostbite. Thousands more suffered in silence, afraid of being left behind. Food became another enemy. Italian field kitchens couldn't function in the cold. Soup froze before it could be distributed. Bread had to be broken with hammers. Olive oil solidified into useless blocks. Men survived on frozen rations that had to be thawed against their bodies. They ate uncooked pasta, crunching it like crackers. They boiled leather equipment straps for the tiny amount of nutrition. They caught and ate rats. When horses died, units would descend on the carcass like wolves. Men fought over the liver, the heart, any organ that could be eaten raw for its warmth. Spring 1942 brought relief from the cold, but not from the suffering. The spring thaw turned the steppe into an ocean of mud. Vehicles sank to their axles. Supply convoys took days to cover distances that should take hours. Ammunition couldn't reach the front. Medical supplies ran out. The CSIR was combat ineffective. General Messa wrote a final report before being recalled to Italy. This force cannot survive another winter without proper equipment. To send more troops without addressing fundamental supply issues would be criminal. Despite these clear warnings from the first winter, Mussolini would double down on his Russian gamble. May 1942. Hitler unveiled Operation Case Blue in his Wolf's Lair headquarters. The new strategy abandoned the drive toward Moscow. Instead, German forces would strike south. They would capture the Caucasus oil fields. They would cut the Volga River at Stalingrad. They would strangle the Soviet war machine by denying it fuel. But this ambitious plan required enormous manpower. Therefore, Hitler needed his allies to hold the lengthening flanks. Hitler's request to Mussolini was specific. "I need your troops to hold the Don River line while my armies take Stalingrad and the Caucasus." Any rational leader would have refused. The CSIR was already shattered. Italy lacked the resources for a larger commitment. But Mussolini saw opportunity where others saw disaster. Therefore, he eagerly agreed to expand Italian forces in Russia from 60,000 to 230,000 men. The expansion created the ARMIR, Armata Italiana in Russia, the Italian Eighth Army. 3 new infantry divisions joined: the Sforzesca, the Ravenna, and the Coseria. More importantly, Mussolini sent the Alpini Corps, Italy's elite mountain troops. The irony was lost on no one except Mussolini. Mountain specialists were being sent to defend flat river plains. It was like sending submarine crews to fight in the desert. General Giovanni Messe was recalled to Italy. He had complained too much. He had been too honest about Italian weakness. His replacement was General Italo Garibaldi. Garibaldi was chosen for one quality. He wouldn't argue with the Germans. He would accept whatever sector they assigned. He would make no demands for supplies. He would send no pessimistic reports to Rome. He was a perfect yes man for an impossible situation. July 1942. The ARMIR began taking positions along the Don River. They were assigned 270 kilometers of front, an impossible length for any army to defend effectively. To put this in perspective, the entire Western Front in World War I was 700 kilometers, defended by millions of men. The Italians were expected to hold over a third of that distance with 230,000 men. No reserves, and almost no tanks. The positions they inherited were pathetic. Shallow trenches scraped from the hard earth. No concrete bunkers. No minefields. No prepared kill zones. The Germans had promised to provide construction materials. The materials never arrived. Italian soldiers dug with their helmets when shovels broke. They reinforced trenches with stones carried from distant quarries. They strung barbed wire that they knew wouldn't stop tanks. Lieutenant Giuseppe Romano wrote, "We are building sandcastles to stop a tsunami." The supply situation was catastrophic from day one. The ARMIR was at the end of a 2,000-kilometer supply line. Every bullet, every can of food, every liter of fuel had to travel from Italy through Germany, through Poland, across Ukraine. The Italians had few trucks. They relied on horses and mules. A single supply run could take 3 weeks. By the time supplies arrived, they were often useless. Food had rotted. Ammunition was for weapons they didn't have. Medicine had expired. The Germans made everything worse. They controlled the railways. Italian supply trains were given lowest priority. They would sit on sidings for days while German trains passed. German quartermasters redirected Italian supplies for their own use. When Italians complained, Germans would shrug and blame partisans. General Garibaldi documented these thefts but never protested. He didn't want to seem difficult. August 1942. The Italians dug in along the Don and waited. They could see across the river to Soviet positions. They could hear Russian voices at night. They could smell cooking fires. Sometimes, Soviet loudspeakers would broadcast in Italian. "Go home while you can. Winter is coming. You will freeze like the Germans did at Moscow." The propaganda was crude but effective. Every Italian soldier knew about the Wehrmacht's defeat at Moscow the previous winter. If the mighty German army had frozen, what chance did they have? As autumn approached, veterans of the previous winter tried to prepare newcomers. They taught them to stuff newspaper in their boots. They showed them how to wrap their rifles in cloth to keep the oil from freezing. They demonstrated how to recognize the early stages of frostbite. But there was only so much knowledge could do without proper equipment. Therefore, 170,000 new Italian soldiers faced the approaching winter with the same inadequate gear that had failed the previous year. While the Italians dug their inadequate trenches, Soviet scouts watched from across the river. They counted Italian positions. They noted the gap between units. They identified artillery positions. They marked supply dumps. Every detail was reported back to Moscow. In the Kremlin, Stalin and his generals studied these reports. They identified the Italian sector as the weakest point in the entire Axis line. They began planning an operation that would destroy not just the Italian Eighth Army, but the entire German position in southern Russia. As the Italians dug in along the Don, 500 kilometers away, Soviet generals were planning their destruction. The Alpine Corps represented Italy's finest soldiers. 3 divisions of mountain troops: the Giulia, the Kunance, and the Tridentina. These men came from the Alps. They grew up climbing mountains. They could operate in terrain where other soldiers would die. They had specialized equipment: ice axes, climbing ropes, mountain boots with cleats. They had trained for years to fight in vertical terrain. They were experts at ambush from above, at defending mountain passes, at surviving in high-altitude cold. But the Don River front was flatter than a table. Therefore, everything they had trained for was useless. Captain Marco Bertolini of the Giulia Division wrote the absurdity in his journal. "We are mountain troops defending a river plain. It's like asking sailors to fight in a desert. We can see for 50 kilometers in every direction. There is no high ground. There are no defensive positions. We are absolutely exposed." The Alpini tried to adapt. They dug deeper trenches. They constructed elaborate camouflage. They created interlocking fields of fire. But they knew it was hopeless. When Soviet tanks came, there would be nowhere to hide. The Alpini had another problem: pride. These were elite troops who had never lost a battle. They had fought in Ethiopia. They had fought in Albania. They had always won. Now they were mixed with regular infantry who lacked their training and discipline. The regular troops looked to the Alpini for leadership. But the Alpini couldn't perform miracles. Therefore, their presence created false confidence that would prove fatal. October 1942. The Alpini took their positions along the Don. The Giulia Division held the center. The Cunense held the left. The Tridentina held the right. Between them, they were responsible for 80 kilometers of front. Each division had about 15,000 men. Simple math showed the impossibility. That's one man every 5 meters, with no reserves, no depth, no ability to respond to breakthrough. The Alpini tried to maintain their mountain traditions in this alien landscape. They sang their traditional songs at night. They wore their distinctive feathered caps despite regulations. They maintained higher standards of discipline and cleanliness than other units. Veterans from other divisions would walk kilometers to see the famous Alpini. They would ask for autographs. They would take photographs. Everyone believed that if the Alpini were here, things couldn't be that bad. This faith would make the coming disaster even more traumatic. November brought the first snows. The Alpini were used to snow, but not like this. Mountain snow was different. It fell on slopes where it could be managed. It created defensive positions. It could be an ally. But steppe snow was an enemy. It fell horizontally, driven by winds with nothing to stop them. It filled trenches in minutes. It created drifts that buried supply routes. It turned the landscape into a featureless white desert where direction lost meaning. Corporal Luigi Battisti of the Tridentina described the disorientation. "In the mountains, you always know where you are. Up is up, down is down. Here, everything is the same. The white ground meets the white sky. You can walk in circles and never know it. Men get lost going to the latrine and are found frozen 50 meters from their position." The Alpini's mountain skills were worse than useless. They were dangerous. Men kept looking for high ground that didn't exist. They kept trying to apply mountain tactics to flat terrain. While the Italians prepared their defenses in Moscow, Stalin's generals had identified them as the weakest link. November 1942. In the Kremlin, Soviet generals presented their plan to Stalin. General Georgy Zhukov pointed at the map. His finger traced the Don River. "Here," he said, "the Italians. Here, the Romanians. These are the weak points." Stalin studied the positions. He saw what his generals saw. The Germans had gambled everything on taking Stalingrad. They had left their flanks protected by weaker allies. It was a fatal mistake. The Soviet plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. It would be a double envelopment. 2 massive pincers would break through the Romanian positions north and south of Stalingrad. They would meet behind the German 6th Army, trapping it. But the Italians were also part of the plan. Therefore, they too would be destroyed to prevent any relief attempts. Soviet intelligence was thorough. Agents had counted every Italian gun. They knew which units had ammunition shortages. They knew where the command posts were located. They knew that Italian anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate T-34 armor. They knew the Italians had almost no reserves. General Nikolai Vatutin, commanding the Southwestern Front, told his staff, "The Italians will break in the first hour." The Soviets assembled their forces in complete secrecy. They moved at night. They maintained radio silence. They created false positions to deceive German reconnaissance. By mid-November, they had concentrated massive forces opposite the Italian and Romanian positions. Over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, 14,000 artillery pieces. It was the largest concentration of force in the war so far. Italian soldiers sensed something coming. Patrols reported increased Soviet activity. Observers noted new tracks in the snow across the river. Deserters warned of massive buildups. Captain Francesco de Lorenzo wrote to his wife, "Everyone knows something terrible is about to happen. We can feel it. The Russians have stopped their harassment attacks. It's like the calm before a storm. We check our ammunition. We clean our weapons. We write our letters. We wait." Italian intelligence officers compiled these reports. They presented them to General Garibaldi. He forwarded them to German headquarters. The German response was dismissive. "Italians seeing ghosts again," wrote one German staff officer. "Southern temperament unsuited to defensive warfare." The Germans were fixated on Stalingrad. They couldn't imagine the Soviets had reserves for a major offensive. They believed their own propaganda about Soviet weakness. November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began, but against the Romanians first. The Italians heard the thunder to their south. They saw the flashes on the horizon. Radio reports came in fragments. Massive attack. Romanians collapsing. Tanks breaking through. The Italian soldiers knew they would be next. They checked their weapons again. They counted their pathetic ammunition supplies. 20 rounds per rifle. 3 grenades per man. 5 shells per artillery piece. It wouldn't be enough. December came. The Italians had been temporarily spared while the Soviets completed the encirclement of Stalingrad. But this was not mercy. It was calculation. The Soviets were preparing an even larger operation, Operation Little Saturn. This would destroy the Italian Eighth Army and prevent any German attempt to relieve Stalingrad. General Vatutin had specific instructions from Stalin. The Italians must not just be defeated. They must be annihilated as a warning to other German allies. December 15th, 1942, the night before the attack. Along the Italian lines, men couldn't sleep. They stood in their frozen trenches, staring across the dawn. Some prayed, some wrote final letters, some simply waited. Private Antonio Russo later recalled, "We could hear them out there. Engines running. Tanks moving into position. We knew dawn would bring death. We had nowhere to run. Behind us was endless steppe. In front of us was the entire Red Army." On December 16, 1942, the storm that would destroy the Italian Eighth Army finally broke. 4 a.m., December 16, 1942. The horizon erupted. Over 1,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. The barrage was beyond anything the Italians had experienced. Shells landed every second. The frozen earth erupted in fountains of dirt and ice. Trenches collapsed. Bunkers disintegrated. Men were buried alive. Others were torn apart by shrapnel. The noise was so intense that men's eardrums burst. They couldn't hear their own screams. Sergeant Mario Rigoni was in a forward observation post. The world ended. That's the only way to describe it. The earth jumped like a living thing. The air became solid with metal. You couldn't breathe without tasting copper. Men next to me simply disappeared. One moment they were there. The next, there was only red mist and scattered equipment. The barrage lasted 2 hours. Then came the tanks. T-34s rolled forward in waves, 20, 50, 100 at a time. Italian anti-tank guns fired desperately. The shells bounced off Soviet armor like pebbles. The tanks didn't even slow down. They drove over Italian positions, crushing trenches with their tracks. Machine guns fired until they melted. Rifles were useless. Men threw grenades that exploded harmlessly against tank hulls. Behind the tanks came Soviet infantry. Not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands. They came in waves that seemed endless. When one wave was shot down, another appeared. The Italians fired until their ammunition ran out. Then they fought with bayonets. Then they fought with shovels. Then they ran. The Ravenna Division was the first to break. Its front line ceased to exist in the first hour. Command posts were overrun before they could send reports. Artillery positions were captured before they could fire. Within 3 hours, the division had disintegrated. Soldiers fled in panic. Officers couldn't rally them. There was nowhere to rally to. Everything was chaos. The Coseria Division lasted longer but suffered the same fate. Its commander tried to organize a defense. He gathered remnants of broken units. He established a new line. Soviet tanks smashed through it in minutes. He tried again, the same result. By noon, he had no division left to command, just scattered groups of terrified men running west. The Soviet breakthrough was total. They poured through gaps in the Italian line. Tank brigades raced into the Italian rear. They shot up supply columns. They destroyed artillery positions. They overran field hospitals. They created panic far behind the front lines. Italian units that hadn't even been attacked began retreating. Fear spread faster than the Soviet advance. General Garibaldi tried to respond, but his communications were destroyed. He couldn't contact his divisions. He couldn't coordinate any defense. He sent runners who never returned. He dispatched officers who found only empty positions. By evening of the first day, he had lost control of his army. The Italian Eighth Army existed only on paper. What followed was not a retreat. It was a death march across the frozen steppe. December 17, 1942. The retreat began. But retreat suggests organization. This was chaos. 200,000 men fleeing west through the Russian winter. No formation, no leadership, no plan. Just the desperate urge to escape. Men abandoned everything that slowed them down. Weapons, equipment, wounded comrades. The strong pushed ahead. The weak fell behind. Those who fell didn't get up. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. Wind drove ice crystals that cut exposed skin. Snow blindness struck men who lost their goggles. Feet froze inside boots. Frozen feet turned black. Black feet had to be amputated. But there were no doctors. No medical supplies. Men cut off their own toes with bayonets to stop gangrene from spreading. Lieutenant Paolo Monti kept a diary during the retreat. Day 3. Found Corporal Bianchi frozen to death standing upright. He had been walking and simply stopped. His eyes were still open. Day 4. Men are eating leather. They cut strips from boots and belts. Boil them in snow. It provides no nutrition but fills the stomach. Day 5. Saw men fighting over a dead horse. They used knives, rocks, their hands. They were no longer human. Soviet cavalry pursued the fleeing columns. Cossack squadrons appeared from nowhere. Sabers flashed. Men fell into the snow and didn't rise. Soviet aircraft strafed the retreat. Machine guns raked the black columns visible against white snow. There was no cover. no defense. Men could only trudge forward and hope. Hunger became desperation. Italian soldiers hadn't eaten real food in days. They gnawed on frozen bread hard as stone. They sucked on ice for moisture. When horses died, men rushed the carcass. They hacked off chunks of meat with bayonets. They ate it raw, the blood freezing on their faces. Some men went mad from hunger. They attacked comrades for their rations. They had to be shot or left behind. The wounded suffered beyond description. There were no vehicles to carry them. Comrades faced an impossible choice: help a wounded friend and likely die together, or abandon him to freeze alone. Most chose abandonment. The retreat route was lined with wounded men calling for help. Their voices grew weaker, then silent. By morning, they were white mounds in the snow. Captain Roberto Larici described finding an abandoned field hospital. Hundreds of wounded had been left. They were still alive but freezing to death. They begged us to shoot them. We had no ammunition to spare. We could only close the door and keep walking. Their screams followed us for kilometers. Only the Alpini maintained any cohesion in this apocalypse. Their discipline held. They retreated in formation. They carried their wounded. They shared their rations. They fought rearguard actions to slow Soviet pursuit. But even the elite Alpini were dying. Therefore, they decided on one last desperate gamble at a place called Nikolaevka. January 26, 1943. The village of Nikolaevka. The surviving Italians had been compressed into a pocket. Soviet forces surrounded them. There was no escape route, no rescue coming, no supplies remaining. About 40,000 Italians were trapped, mostly Alpini from the Tridentina division. They faced a choice: surrender and likely die in captivity, or attempt a breakthrough and likely die fighting. General Luigi Reverberi commanded the Tridentina. He was 50 years old. He had fought in World War I. He knew this was the end. But he also knew the Alpini would never surrender. He gathered his officers. The plan was simple because there were no options. They would attack directly ahead. They would break through or die trying. 6 a.m. The Alpini formed up. There was no artillery preparation, no shells left, no covering fire, no ammunition, just men with rifles and bayonets. Reverberi stood at the front. He raised his pistol. He shouted the words that would become legend: "Tridentina forward." The Alpini charged. They ran through knee-deep snow. Soviet machine guns opened fire. Men fell in rows. The survivors kept running. They reached the Soviet lines. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Italians fought with rifle butts, knives, bare hands. The Soviets were shocked by the fury of the assault. For a moment, their line wavered. Sergeant Giuseppe Valentini was in the charge. "We fought like madmen." A Soviet soldier pointed his rifle at me. It didn't fire. Frozen. I hit him with my rifle butt. He fell. I kept running. Everyone was screaming. Not war cries, just screaming. We had become animals. But animals that wanted to live. The breakthrough succeeded through pure desperation. The Alpini punched a hole in Soviet lines. Thousands of Italians poured through. They kept running west. Soviet forces pursued but couldn't close the gap. The Italians had nothing left to lose. They would run until they died or reached safety. The cost was enormous. Of 40,000 who attempted the breakout, perhaps 10,000 escaped. The rest died in the assault or froze during the continuing retreat. Entire battalions ceased to exist. The Julia Division, destroyed. The Kunins Division, annihilated. Only fragments of the Tridentina survived. The survivors who stumbled back to Axis lines were ghosts of the army that had left Italy. February 1943. The survivors reached German lines. They were unrecognizable. Bearded, filthy, skeletal. Many had lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Some were snowblind. Others had gone mad. German soldiers photographed them as curiosities. These scarecrows had once been the proud Italian 8th Army. The numbers were catastrophic. Over 70,000 Italian casualties, dead, missing, or captured. The 8th Army had effectively ceased to exist. 10 divisions destroyed. Hundreds of guns lost. Thousands of vehicles abandoned. It was the worst defeat in Italian military history. Worse than Caporetto in World War I. Worse than any colonial disaster. Total annihilation. Mussolini tried to hide the catastrophe. Italian newspapers were forbidden to report it. Radio Rome stayed silent. Families received no information about missing sons. But the truth couldn't be contained. Too many families received no letters. Too many towns had no returning soldiers. Rumors spread. Then testimonies from the first survivors. The reality was worse than any rumor. Private Franco Azzoni made it home to Milan. His mother didn't recognize him. He had lost 30 kilograms. His hair had turned white. He was 21 years old but looked 50. He told his story to anyone who would listen. We were abandoned. The Germans used us as shields. Our own leaders sent us to die for nothing. We fought. We suffered. We died. For what? For Mussolini's pride. These stories spread through Italy like poison. They destroyed the last faith in fascism. Workers struck in northern factories. Students protested in universities. Even within the fascist party, members questioned Mussolini's leadership. The disaster in Russia had broken the spell. Italians saw their leader not as a genius, but as a fool who had sacrificed their sons for nothing. July 25, 1943, 6 months after the ARMIR disaster. The fascist Grand Council voted to remove Mussolini from power. The king had him arrested. Crowds celebrated in the streets. The man who had sent 230,000 Italians to Russia was finally gone. But for the families of the dead, it was too late. Their sons would never come home. September 8, 1943. Italy switched sides. The country that had been Germany's ally became its enemy. German forces occupied northern Italy. They treated it as conquered territory. The Germans remembered Italian betrayal in Russia. They showed no mercy. The cycle of suffering that began on the frozen dawn continued in the Italian mountains. Some Italian prisoners wouldn't return until 1954. They spent over a decade in Soviet camps. They survived on 300 grams of bread daily. They worked in mines and forests. They died of disease, starvation, cold. Of the 70,000 casualties, perhaps 10,000 were prisoners. Only 1,200 came home. They returned to a country that had tried to forget them. Italy was now a republic. The war seemed like ancient history. These ghosts from Russia didn't fit the new narrative. What began as Mussolini's bid for glory and Hitler's new order ended with 230,000 Italians discovering the true cost of their leader's ambitions. The ARMIR campaign transformed from a symbol of fascist Italy's power projection to the embodiment of its military and moral bankruptcy. Italian soldiers, sent to fight an ideological war with cardboard boots and obsolete weapons, paid the ultimate price for their leadership's delusions. The Italian soldier whose letter opened our story was never found. Like tens of thousands of his comrades, his body remains somewhere in the Russian steppe. No grave. No marker, no name, just another casualty of political vanity. These men were not heroes in any traditional sense. They didn't die defending their homeland. They didn't die for freedom or justice. They died because their leader needed to feel important. They died because they were born in the wrong country at the wrong time. They died because nobody with power cared if they lived. The Italian campaign in Russia stands as one of history's starkest examples of military incompetence and political delusion. 250,000 men sent to fight a war they couldn't win, with equipment that couldn't protect them, for reasons that made no sense. They were betrayed by their leaders, abandoned by their allies, and destroyed by their enemies. Their story is not one of glory but of waste, not of heroism but of suffering, not of victory but of complete, total, unmitigated disaster. They were not forgotten by history. They were betrayed by it. And in that betrayal lies a lesson, that wars are started by those who won't fight them and fought by those who can't stop them. The Italian Eighth Army learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. They paid for it with everything they had. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more fascinating World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.